a while, right? Well, I'm back in a new surrounding. I was living in Ireland for years and now I've moved to England and become a dandy. I've got a divan and look at this beautiful, aesthetically pleasing living room. Anyway, welcome to a new series that I like to call Starting a Revolution from My Divan. In this episode, we'll be talking about the comparison between gay rights and legalization of marijuana. A lot of people think that it's hyperbole to compare the two, and they think it's insulting. But as a bisexual, I'm going to share my perspective on why I think it's a valid comparison. Anyway, let's get started and explore this issue. For those who read my blog, you might recognize the contents of this video as being from a blog post I wrote. I wrote it for the Diversity of Classic Rock, crazyOnClassicRock.com, as the 420 special, Why I Compare Marijuana and Gay Rights. Anyway, some people don't like to read and would prefer to hear it in a video format. So I got you covered. So I've turned the manga into an anime. First, let's set the scene. A lot of Americans have this misconception that Europe is so much more progressive than America, when it's really more complicated than that, and I can definitely say that with authority as I've lived on both sides of the Atlantic. So one issue where America does beat Europe is marijuana legalization. In the United States, there are multiple states that have legalized marijuana. No country in Europe has legalized it like the United States has. So let's start setting the scene. Here's basically the state of cannabis in Europe, as of right now in 2023. Call me a cynic, but whenever I read news about cannabis legalization in Europe, I take it about as seriously as Ray or Dave Davis when they would talk about a Kinks reunion, or Noel and Liam Gallagher when they talk about an Oasis reunion. As in, I'm not getting my hopes up. I'm not holding my breath. I'm half joking with that comparison, but I've seen news stories praising Portugal for decriminalizing drugs, Spain for having cannabis clubs, Malta and Luxembourg for legalizing cannabis. However, there are no dispensaries. And now Germany for merely talking about legalizing cannabis. Their plan's kind of half-assed, really. It's definitely not like the US or Canada, which definitely have much better systems. And the status quo still remains in Germany, so it's not like there's really that much progress going on. And of course, everyone knows about Amsterdam and its 420 friendliness. Well, it no longer has a monopoly on that, and hasn't for some time now. The moral of the story is, read beyond the headline and comb through the fine print. And as somebody who studied journalism, I have a master's degree in it, it is just upsetting and surprising how many people just don't read the headline. Some people are just too lazy these days. Now we come to the country that I used to live in, Ireland. Now there's been a lot of talk about the Citizens' Assembly on Drug Use, and we are approaching their last ever meeting. There have been claims of Ireland having a health-led approach. Only applies to first-time offenders in limited cases, though. And it just doesn't make any sense. Why only the first offense? Doesn't it continue to be a health issue if we can understand that the first instance of drug use where somebody is caught, the first time they're caught, is a health issue? How come it isn't for the subsequent cases? As long as people are threatened with jail sentences for drug use, that is not health-led. If anything, it is harming people's health. It is being chaired by a man who is surrounded by reefer madness types, and the reefer madness types are getting a lot more time than the pro-legalization crowd. And honestly, this is like having a citizens' assembly on gay rights chaired by someone from the Catholic Church. I know that there are a lot of closeted homosexuals and bisexuals in the Catholic Church, but they've got a lot of internalized homophobia. It is like having a Holocaust museum with no Jewish people in leadership. I'm a firm believer in nothing about us without us. And I do not expect anything good to come out of the Citizens' Assembly, because in Ireland, this is a country that has let pedophiles and violent criminals get away with such heinous crimes. Meanwhile, our drug laws there are draconian and people are being locked up. If you're caught with a microscopic amount of marijuana, it's right to jail. A lot of people argue that decriminalization is progress, and in the media, there is a lot of talk of decriminalization in Ireland, and it is dominating the conversation, and some people are just content to stop there. And here's why they're wrong. Decriminalization is the worst of both worlds. It has none of the benefits of legalization, like ensuring safety and harm reduction, and the government getting tax revenue, and almost all of the downsides of criminalization. Weed remains unregulated and criminals keep profiting off of it. Now keep in mind, not all decriminalization approaches are created equal. They can range from the Netherlands policy of tolerance to policies I've seen in the United States, such as fining people for possessing cannabis. Remember that a fine is merely a fee for the rich to do a thing, which means it's a crime if you're poor. And what happens if you can't pay your fines? You go to jail, which still ruins your life. It's a two-tier system. One tier for the rich and one tier for the poor. Cannabis under the system can still be adulterated and unsafe, where the strains on offer are basically, you want it or not, as Blind Boy put it. Another proposal is home grow allow plus cannabis social clubs. Now here's the problem with that approach. There is still no regulation. The government continues to miss out on tax revenue. Cannabis use is still swept under the rug. Plus, with the social clubs, here's the question I see no one asking. How do we ensure there is no discrimination? In a cannabis social club, you can more easily discriminate as it's a private club, while a licensed dispensary can't without consequences as it's a business. If a dispensary were to discriminate, they would get sued, review bombed, basically cancelled. You might as well go the whole 9 yards and legalize and have a Canadian-style system. I think the reason that a lot of people in Ireland do not talk about this, and why I'm thinking about it, is I come from a Jewish background. My dad's family were Jewish, and in Ireland there aren't really any Jewish people. I was pretty much the only Jewish person in the town I was living in, and as soon as I left, the Jewish population went down by 100% because I was the only one there. But anyway, there is a history of Jewish people being discriminated against, where they were excluded from country clubs, where they were excluded from sororities and fraternities. And, obviously if you're a person of color, there was also discrimination there too. And it's just such a shame that the Citizens Assembly is missing voices of non-white and mixed people and immigrants. These voices are definitely, valuable and necessary, and we need to include everybody. Ireland isn't the most diverse country in the world, but it's becoming more diverse. I saw it become more diverse, and I lived there for almost a decade. So we need to include more voices. We need a diversity of voices. Because if not, we miss out on those perspectives. Anyway, under this system, the operations still remain in the hands of gangsters. Decriminalization only serves the gangsters and no one else. It does make me wonder if there are politicians in cahoots with drug dealers. Oh wait, there are. Anything's possible in this world. When you really dissect what it means to decriminalize marijuana, you begin to find out that it's not out of the kindness of the government's heart that they're doing this. It's merely a cost-cutting measure. Don't just take it from me. There's a great article from Slate about this called Less Harsh Punishments, More People Punished. To sum up the article, decriminalization seems like a compassionate stepping stone to progress because it keeps people out of jail and reduces arrests for misdemeanors. But the truth is, with these less harsh punishments, more people find themselves in the net of people being punished. When an offense is decriminalized, the government don't need to spend taxpayer money on public defenders, and they save money by locking fewer people up in jail. But if you don't pay your fine, as I said before, you end up in jail anyway. Which is kind of counterintuitive if you think about it, because wouldn't it make more sense to have people work off their fines through community service if they truly cannot afford to pay? Because it does cost money to jail people, and jails are becoming more and more overcrowded, and how do we solve the overcrowding problem? We free people who are, on these drug offenses that aren't crimes in the first place. Still, decriminalization does not get enforced evenly and equally, and it's another form of discrimination. It's a postcode lottery. It all depends on which side of the train tracks you live on. If you're on the poor side of the train tracks, you are often going to be targets of broken windows policing. Those in low-income areas more likely find themselves being targeted by police and on the receiving end of a fine. Those in more affluent neighborhoods, however, find that the police are much more lenient towards them and give them a break. So again, it's two systems. One for the rich, one for the poor. And any system like that is no good. We need equality. And it's such a shame that people don't talk about class issues enough. We need more people on the left really focusing on these issues. Even less harsh punishments are still punishments because, as Malcolm Feely said in the 70s, the process is the punishment. Even just being fined or having to go to court is embarrassing and can ruin your reputation. Sure, it may not be the trial of the century or the crime of the century, but still. You'll see how this less harsh punishments, more people punished principle applies in the gay rights analogy later in this blog post. Weed legalization is an issue I've thought a lot about as someone who has used marijuana in the past and unfortunately now does not have access and does not use it at this time because I don't want to get in trouble. Anyway, I like to come up with new thought experiments and ways of persuasion when it comes to talking about the issues I care about. In this case, it all starts with this idea. The law is not always right. It's good and necessary to question authority and the law. The question shouldn't be, is it legal or not? But rather, is the law right or wrong? Is the law ethical? What is legal and what is right does not always align. Any person with a working brain can understand this. All sorts of atrocious things were legal at one point. Slavery, the Holocaust, child labor, colonization, sexual harassment, gay and trans panic defense laws, which are still on the books in some places. It's also still legal in the United States to pay disabled employees less than minimum wage. Why? Because some people in power said so, and those in power are often bad people. And plenty of things that aren't bad at all were once illegal. Homosexuality was illegal, and still is in over 70 countries. Hiding Jewish people during the Holocaust was illegal. Interracial marriage was illegal. Helping slaves escape was illegal. Women voting was illegal. A lot of people love to make the cop-out when it comes to legalization drugs debate. That, well, I don't care if you smoke weed, but the law is the law. If you smoke weed, you go to jail. Simple as. Yes, that is the law right now, but you know what's been done in the past? Laws have been changed. We can right the wrongs of the past going forward. I notice the same energy between people who think like this and people I talked to when I was a teenager who were against gay marriage and would say things like, well, I don't care if you're gay, but marriage is between a man and a woman because the law and the Bible says so. Well, who wrote the Bible? People wrote the Bible. It's bullshit. The Bible is just a fiction book. And here's my question. Do you agree that it was right for gay people to have been executed, jailed, castrated, or fined? It was the law at that time. So by your logic, well, they shouldn't have been doing one up the bum, no harm done if they didn't want to be punished. Even though being gay harms no one. Similarly, smoking weed harms no one. Homophobic laws are wrong, as are these backwards prohibition laws. Now, some people will come at me and go, but Angie, people are born gay. It's biology. Being a stoner is a choice. That's a false equivalence. How disrespectful. And in response to that, I say it's a bad argument. Actually a homophobic one when you think about it. Why is the born this way argument homophobic? Well, first off, it implies that there's something inherently shameful about being gay, and well, they can't help it, so we can't hate them for that. Let's take a step back and think about it. Why is having homosexual attraction seen as inferior? What makes it inferior? Why is heterosexual always seen as the default? Why is heterosexual seen as better? Who is a gay relationship hurting? Even if someone chooses to be gay or bisexual, what is the problem? Wouldn't it still be wrong to discriminate even if it was a choice? In short, it doesn't matter if being gay is a choice or not. Being gay is okay. It's not like because a characteristic is immutable, a bigot is going to go, welp, I guess I can't be bigoted against you now. Some people are just too far gone, and no argument you use will ever convince them. And that's the way it is. The best thing to do with these too far gone people is to not engage. Like Bianca Del Rio said, not today, Satan, not today. Religion is a choice in places where you have freedom of religion. I used to be Jewish, but I left the religion when I was 10 years old. That was my choice. I chose to be an atheist. If someone discriminates against me for being an atheist, it is still wrong even though I chose to be an atheist. Did you know that atheists are one of the least trusted groups in society? Yeah, even less trusted than Muslims. Did you know that even in some parts of the United States, atheists can't run for office, and you can't join the Boy Scouts if you're an atheist? If you're an atheist ex-Muslim in a Muslim country, you could end up disowned by your family, or worse, dead. Heck, there are a lot of things about people that are choices. Your hairstyle, tattoos, piercings, any body modifications, your subculture. It is still wrong to fire or not hire someone for having tattoos or piercings or an unconventional hairstyle, provided their body modifications or hairstyle don't interfere with their job. I remember when I was a kid, people would say, oh, you'll never get a job with tattoos. And now, you're the odd one out if you don't have a tattoo. Well, I don't have one because I'm needle phobic. And I can't commit to anything. Oh, how things have changed. How many men out there feel the need to cut their hair shorter for a job interview so they can make a good first impression? Why is it a good first impression to have short hair in the first place? Who made these rules? Self-expression is important, and without self-expression, life would be boring. So it's irrelevant whether or not homosexuality is a choice. Next, let's talk about how the prohibition of marijuana is actually a biology issue. Just like homophobic laws banning something that is popularly believed to be someone's nature, laws that ban marijuana are banning nature itself. What do I mean by this? Well, where does marijuana come from? Say it with me, plants. Plants which grow naturally on this planet and in nature. So isn't it ludicrous to ban something that grows completely naturally? It's just as ridiculous to ban marijuana as it is to ban bananas, avocados, or chocolate. Yep, because some people in charge think a plant is stinky and makes you act funny, they'd be like, ban it. Which oddly enough creates hostile conditions so people can't research and develop new marijuana strains that are less stinky. Research into the effects of smoking marijuana is also hindered. As well, this plant in question is one that many people find beneficial for their health, be it mental health or physical health. Anecdotally, I can say that when I was in California, a state where marijuana is legal, I didn't experience any cramps, and this was before my hysterectomy, by the way. I didn't have any back pain either, and I didn't need to wear my corset at all. These days, I have to wear my corset when I leave the house, or I'll get back pain, even after my hysterectomy. On top of that, I've had anxiety for 3/4 of my life and difficulty sleeping, but my anxiety improves when I have access to cannabis. I am somebody who refuses to take medicine whenever possible because I don't react well to it, and I don't trust Big Pharma. So why is someone like me not able to get a prescription for back pain, anxiety, and insomnia? Why should I have to go through a treatment treadmill and go through Olmec's Temple from Legends of the Hidden Temple or the Aggro Crag from Nickelodeon Guts to get what I need? Healthcare shouldn't be like one of those Japanese game shows with all those obstacles. Isn't my lived experience enough evidence? As someone who's bisexual, I'm not offended at all by this comparison. If anything, I'm more offended by straight people condescendingly speaking over me and telling me that I'm wrong. If anything, I think that when we draw comparisons between different social justice issues, it helps us understand each other better, and this increases solidarity. And we need solidarity, now more than ever before. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. If we put ourselves in other people's shoes more, I think the world would be a better place. I will often make connections, comparisons, and draw parallels between different situations that you may not think about comparing, because at the end of the day, we are not that different after all. And when we find patterns, we can come to a better understanding of the world. History repeats itself, after all. And now we get to our storytelling device, the Rolling Stones video for We Love You, released in 1967. Previously, I made a trailer for this video of sorts, talking about the importance of the timing and the theme of the video. A lot of people don't think about the timing and the importance of it, but it's important, and here's why. If you want to hear someone else make the same exact comparison I did, well, look at the Rolling Stones and their music video for We Love You. What a way to flip off the establishment. To think that only a decade before this, Elvis was in trouble for doing the wrong movements and had to go into the army to clean up his image. And now you have a rock band being like, fuck this, we're not going into hiding, you can't silence us. 3 members of the band, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and Brian Jones, were arrested for possession of marijuana and were given lengthy sentences, which were later dropped. This actually ended up screwing over the Rolling Stones to some extent. You might know how the Kinks were banned from touring the United States for 4 years due to multiple complaints from industry people. Well, the Rolling Stones didn't tour the United States for almost 3 years, and that's because of Brian Jones' multiple marijuana convictions, making it impossible for him to get a visa to tour. His lawyers were basically useless and told him to plead guilty, basically ending his career as an international rock star. This eventually led to Brian Jones being fired from the band, and he died not long after that. Some speculate that he was murdered. Brian Jones' drug possession convictions ultimately led to his demise. So I'd argue that the comparison that the Rolling Stones made to the trial of Oscar Wilde, made in the video, isn't completely hyperbolic. Brian Jones' friend, Stash DeRolla, said, "I blame the police as a tool of stupidly conservative, reactionary climate for provoking this crisis that led to his estrangement from the Stones and his ultimate demise." In this interview with Glide magazine, Stash DeRolla said, "The arrests were a deliberate campaign by the establishment. It's been established clearly by people who are in the know that it was a deliberate campaign to decapitate the Rolling Stones, who were considered a menace to society." Just imagine that. Like, they're just entertainers. And older generations call us snowflakes. I wish the boomers would learn from this. Anyway, this extraordinary arrest, which was really on completely trumped up charges, deliberately timed to coincide with Mick and Keith's trial, which was front page news that day, and they leaked it to the press so that we would be arrested as well. You see, if they could get Brian Jones out of the way, that was 3 of the Rolling Stones out of the band, and they would disappear. This was the goal that they were pursuing. It actually backfired, but in the process it cost Brian his life. And that is the truth. Had Brian Jones not been arrested, he might not have been in the 27 Club at all. And similarly, had Oscar Wilde not been arrested, he might have lived longer than 46 years. Do you think of Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and Brian Jones as criminals? If you're a serious, reasonable person, probably not. But what if it was your neighbor, your coworker, your classmate, someone from your house of worship? Would you look at them differently than a rock star? What's the difference between a rock star and an ordinary person anyway? Some money and a bit of talent. We Love You was written as a thank you to the fans and the contemporaries who supported the Rolling Stones during this controversial time. The timing of the release of this song and the music video is of note. The year it came out was 1967, the year that homosexuality was decriminalized in England and Wales. Pay special attention to that wording. Homosexuality wasn't decriminalized in Northern Ireland and Scotland until later. And pay special attention to the decriminalized part. Gay men were still being arrested post-1967, and in fact, in greater numbers. And gay bars and bathhouses were regularly raided. Tom Robinson sang about that in his famous song Glad to be Gay. In fact, here's just a little verse from Glad to be Gay by Tom Robinson. So sit back and watch as they close down our clubs, arrest us for meeting, and raid all our pubs. Make sure your boyfriend's at least 21, which is in reference to the age of consent still not being equalized, and it wasn't equalized for decades. So only your friends and your brothers get done. Lie to your workmates and lie to your folks. Put down the queens and the anti-queer jokes. Gay libs ridiculous, join the laughter. The buggers are legal now. What more are they after? The UK is where the most famous cases of gay men being fined or jailed for just being gay happened. Keep in mind that these are not the only cases. These are just a handful of these cases. There were many other gay and bisexual men who were victimized by institutionalized homophobia, but because they were private individuals, their stories are not known. But please keep this in mind. Institutionalized homophobia was not that long ago. In fact, if you believe that slavery and Jim Crow was recent history, then so are these homophobic laws that have caused harm to our community. If you look at the timelines of civil rights and gay liberation, you'll find that they're contemporaneous. Here's a little graphic showing you. All right, Professor Moon is here with your gay history lesson. Let's learn about institutionalized homophobia from the 60s and before. Let's get started. Eccentric 1960s record producer Joe Meek was basically the British Phil Spector, for better or worse. He was fined £15 for having gay sex. This arrest affected him for the rest of his life, with the Cray twins blackmailing him over his sexuality. The Cray twins, by the way, were both bisexual. Beatles manager Brian Epstein was arrested in 1957, a decade before gay sex was legalized in England, or rather decriminalized. In 1967, he died of a drug overdose at just 32 years old. Do you want another Beatles connection? The man who played Paul's grandfather in A Hard Day's Night, Wilfred Bramble, was arrested in a public toilet in Shepherd's Bush in 1962 for cottaging, just 2 years before the film came out. He was fined 25 guineas and given a conditional discharge. While they weren't jailed or castrated like what happened in the following examples, the process is the punishment. They were arrested for no reason, fined for no reason, and humiliated for no reason. It was still unjust. And keep this in mind, working class people were treated even worse. Working class gay people were still being arrested and still being jailed. Before this, it didn't matter how well respected, successful, or rich you were. If you were outed as gay and you got in big trouble for it, your life was over. That's what happened in these three following examples. Let's go back to the 1950s. World War II's over, and guess what? The man that saved your country has been arrested for being gay. World War II codebreaker Alan Turing was one of the most famous cases of all and the most heartbreaking. One day in 1952, at the age of 39, he was out with his 19-year-old boyfriend Arnold Murray, and his house was burglarized. When he made a report to the police, he initially hid the fact, but later mentioned that he had a boyfriend, and then he and his boyfriend were arrested. He was later given a choice between prison and probation, but because he chose probation, he was chemically castrated, which is not unlike what currently happens to gay men in Iran. He ended up getting a criminal record for no good reason. He lost his security clearance and even his job at the government communications headquarters. Not even being a World War II hero saved him. He saved the country, and he was still thrown under the bus. The institutionalized homophobia he experienced ultimately led to his suicide just 2 years later. Decades later in 2017, when they pardoned gay and bisexual men, which was 50 years after England and Wales decriminalized gay sex, they named the amnesty law the Alan Turing Law. Now, what does this have to do with marijuana? Well, keep in mind, the police found out that Alan Turing was gay and he was caught because he was a victim of a crime. If you use drugs, and let's say you're the victim of a crime, let's say you were mugged and you have marijuana on you, or your house was broken into and there's your pot stash right there, or you grow weed in your house, are you really going to report it to the police and then get found out and then you end up getting more punishment than the person who hurt you? These prohibition laws are bad for public safety. Legalizing marijuana isn't just some decadence or debauchery thing. It's also about public safety. People don't trust the police. And you know what? As long as prohibition continues, people are going to not trust the police. The even more heartbreaking thing about Alan Turing. Even if they pardoned all gay and bisexual men straight away in 1967, Alan Turing would still not have qualified for a posthumous pardon. Because had he lived in the 1960s, 70s, or 80s, he could have ended up just like Peter Wells, a gay man who was arrested at the age of 26 for having an 18-year-old boyfriend. Both were consenting adults, yet he ended up behind bars for 2.5 years. Peter Wells was murdered at the age of 31 or 32. Now let's get back into the time machine. We're going to go back 1 century. Exactly 100 years before John Lennon was born, an artist named Simeon Solomon was born. On the 9th of October, 1840. He was born to a prominent, well-off Jewish family in England. His older siblings, Abraham and Rebecca, were also painters. His father, Michael Solomon, was a wealthy merchant and one of the first Jews to be admitted to the freedom of the City of London. As a child, his older brother taught him painting, and he started attending an art academy when he was just 11. As a teenager, when he was attending the Royal Academy, he was introduced to the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and at just 18 years old, he had his first exhibition there at the Royal Academy, and he met his idol, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Within a few years, he surpassed his older brother in popularity. Some themes in his painting were Jewish life, homosexuality, and androgyny. Stuff that's right up my alley. He explored his own sexuality through his art. He was doing well for himself until one night in February 1873, when he and a 60-year-old working-class man named George Roberts were arrested in a public toilet just off of Oxford Street. The two were found guilty of attempted sodomy, and after 6 weeks of detention, Simeon Solomon was released to his cousin on a £100 surety, and luckily, this trial wasn't publicized. Still, being arrested for that. Meanwhile, George Roberts spent 2 years in jail. His family sent him to 2 mental hospitals, because keep in mind, in the old days, being gay was seen as a mental illness. And still was, for a long time after that. He later traveled to Paris and once again was arrested for having sex in a public toilet with a male prostitute. He served 3 months in jail and went back to England. Galleries stopped displaying his work, with some of his work even being destroyed because of homophobic attitudes, and he lost his reputation. By 1879, he ended up in a workhouse, and in those days, there was no welfare state. So that's where the poor went. He continued painting and drawing even during this time with a prolific output. He became an alcoholic and lived in poverty, depending on the kindness of a few family and friends who stood by him. He died in a workhouse in 1905 at the age of 64. One of those cases where a celebrity lost everything. So you see, it doesn't matter if you come from a wealthy family. I had to put the cape back on for this one, because this is one of our main characters, and I gotta be extra as fuck. Anyway, finally, we have the famous story, as discussed in the Rolling Stones music video, The Downfall of Oscar Wilde. You might have read some of his work in English class. Well, I didn't. I was just falling asleep. And if you've seen Velvet Goldmine, which is a great movie by the way, he's totally referenced a lot. I think he's a great example of a person who was born way too early. He was born in Dublin to a doctor father and an activist mother. He studied classics at Trinity and Oxford before going on to be a successful poet and author. He was a proto-rock star. He went on tour speaking about aestheticism, dressed stylishly, and stood out for being really tall. And he had super long hair for the time. Like, if you look at any photos of him, I was just like, holy crap, that looks like Dave Davis of the Kinks. Basically, he was just a blueprint for the Peacock Revolution of the 1960s. Huge style inspiration. He lived like a rock star. He was extravagant and he was hedonistic. The trajectory of his fame was like that of Simeon Solomon, one of his idols. It was a meteoric rise to fame, but then it all came crashing down at once. Like quite a few historical gay men, some argue he was bisexual, I don't know. He had a wife and children, but had affairs with other men outside of his marriage. And this began in his 30s. One of the most notable affairs was Lord Alfred Douglas, also known as Bosie. They were basically like a Victorian version of Sid and Nancy. Their relationship was just the beginning of Wilde's downfall. Toxic relationship, bad influence. Bosie's father sent a card to Wilde saying that he was a sodomite. They didn't have the word gay back then. Homosexual was also not a word back then. That was the word used towards you if you were gay. And Bosie encouraged his boyfriend to sue him. Wilde took the bait, ignoring the advice from his friends to leave it and run away from homophobic Victorian England. The Marquess of Queensberry was like, I'm about to end this man's whole career. After his lawsuit against the Marquess of Queensberry was an epic fail, he was arrested for having sex with other males, and he was tried at the Old Bailey, a trial of the century. In fact, the first celebrity trial. In the end, he was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor, the harshest sentence possible in this case. There's some really, kind of funny lines. I think there's one that's just extremely Donald Trumpian. I'll just put the quote up there. This just sounds like something Donald Trump would say. Weirdest comparison I'll be making in this video, but it's kind of funny. He was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor, the harshest sentence possible in this case. They wanted to make an example of a famous gay man who was also a socialist. I imagine they didn't take kindly to that either, and as a result, many gay and bisexual men in the UK fled for safety after the trial. In fact, it's not known if Aubrey Beardsley was gay or bisexual, but he was one of the ones who also escaped because of his link to Oscar Wilde. He actually did the drawings for Salome, and he was associated with him, and with guilt by association, he was forced to go to Paris, or he went to France, not Paris. Anyway, an injury in jail ultimately led to him dying of meningitis a few years later in Paris. He lost everything. Worse yet, his family suffered, and their lives would never be the same again. His wife and children's surnames were changed to Holland, and he never saw his children again. He has one grandson, Merlin Holland, and a great-grandson, Lucian Holland, who are both still alive as of me writing this blog post. Now, let's be honest. No serious person sees them as criminals for being gay, that is. I mean, Joe Meek murdered his landlady, but that has nothing to do with him being gay. However, in this last case, it's not so simple for Oscar Wilde. It was a difficult pill to swallow, but it's dishonest if I whitewash the story and just gloss over the fact that some of the males he was with were underage. If they were all consenting adults, there would be no problem. Some people blame Bosie for this, but Wilde was well into his 30s when this was going on, and he had agency, and it was on him to say no. There's no excuse for those actions. God damn it. Can we just put it in the Tyra Banks, I was rooting for you and then you fucked it up? That's my reaction right now. Some will argue that in the Victorian era, the age of consent was lower than it is today. Another example of the law being wrong. And had Wilde been straight, and it were females he was going after, he wouldn't have been arrested. The age difference, regardless, is creepy and wrong. It's also important to note that in recent history, the age of consent for gay and bisexual men was higher because of homophobia. You thought the UK had the monopoly on being homophobic to celebrities. Well, guess what? Introducing Johnny Ray. Johnny Ray is a name that may sound familiar if you've heard the Dexys Midnight Runners song Come On Eileen or Billy Joel's We Didn't Start the Fire. What was his significance in music history? Well, he was a famous singer in the 50s and considered a rock and roll pioneer. Gay people were in rock and roll from the beginning. Ringo Starr even cited Johnny Ray as one of the Beatles' biggest influences alongside Chuck Berry and Little Richard. He started singing as a teenager in Oregon, performing in Portland and Seattle before relocating to Detroit, where he would sing at African-American nightclubs. One night at the Flame, he was discovered by a song plugger and got a record deal with the race record label OK. He got popular in the 1950s for his emotional singing style, which earned him the titles The Prince of Wales, Don't You Love Wordplay, and Mr. Emotion. In 1951, his song Cry topped the charts. He had multiple top 20 hits in the early 50s with songs like The Little White Cloud That Cried, Please Mr. Sun, Walking My Baby Back Home, All of Me, A Sinner Am I, Somebody Stole My Gal, and Candy Lips. He was also in the 1954 film There's No Business Like Show Business with Ethel Merman and Marilyn Monroe. He also appeared on Toast of the Town, which is better known as The Ed Sullivan Show. By the late 50s, however, his career in America declined because of the rise in rock and roll. What a big change. Still, he had a following overseas. He was arrested multiple times in the 50s for soliciting undercover cops at nightclubs for sex. His first arrest was in 1951, and he pleaded guilty and paid a fine. Keep in mind, this is right around the time of Brown versus Board of Education, if you want a little perspective on when this happened. Because he wasn't famous at the time he was arrested, it wasn't a major story, but when he got famous, people found out and rumors spread about him being gay. The following year, he married a woman named Marilyn Morrison as a cover-up, and they divorced not long after. He was arrested in 1959 for the same thing, but by this point, he was not at the peak of his fame. He was the best man at Judy Garland's wedding in 1969, and the two performed together in Europe. He performed in the 1970s and 80s as a cabaret singer and made some TV appearances. He even got name-checked in the lyrics and appeared in Billy Idol's music video for Don't Need a Gun. Still, the institutionalized homophobia had an effect on him mentally, and he was an alcoholic. He died in 1990 at the age of 63 of liver failure. Now let's bring it all back to the music video. The Rolling Stones used the Oscar Wilde trial as a metaphor for their getting in trouble for smoking weed, and you can see Mick, Keith, and Marianne reenacting it with articles of the Rolling Stones' arrest being juxtaposed in the video. Funny enough, in 1895, weed was not only legal, but actually quite easy to purchase. You could buy even harder drugs easily then. It's actually funny that a prudish, intolerant society was so okay with drugs. No doubt that the Rolling Stones make a comparison between the two trials. Now remember in the examples above, these gay men often lost everything. Their reputation, opportunities, money, friends, family. Their lives were never the same again, and often they died relatively young and shells of their former selves. But what about those who are victims of the racist classist failure that is the war on drugs? Which, when you think about it, is it really a war on drugs? It's really more of a war on freedom. I mean, how many things are drugs? Coffee's kind of a drug. I mean, caffeine's a drug. Alcohol's a drug. Cigarettes are a drug. Those are all perfectly legal. Why cannabis? Why is there a distinction made? Who decided this? Because I want to punch them in the face. Similarly, a person who's caught with marijuana, even just a simple possession charge, can lose everything. Although in this case, money and connections can help you. Money gets you a Better Call Saul, or if you're broke, but lucky enough to have lawyer family, you get My Cousin Vinny. To give you a classic rock example, before Scott Gorham was in Thin Lizzy, he was arrested for selling weed to an undercover cop. But thankfully he had a lawyer uncle, and they made a deal, and he didn't get charged at all. All the charges were dropped. And he was able to go to England to become famous and play in Thin Lizzy. But again, what if you weren't so lucky? What can you lose if you're convicted of possession of marijuana? Well, for starters, you can lose your job, or job opportunities if you were a creative like me, like I'm a writer. I don't really have a workplace, but a lot of jobs and workplaces don't want to have someone with a criminal record. I mean, they can hire someone who doesn't have a criminal record. There's heaps of those out there. And if you lose your job, good luck getting a new one. Many jobs do background checks, and they'll see you as sus if you have a marijuana charge. As well, many jobs drug test, and if marijuana comes up positive, bye-bye job offer, and the job that you end up getting is more than likely going to be one with poverty wages and no benefits. Actually, is that a lot of jobs these days? And that's why people go back to committing crimes. That's why crime is going up. That's often someone's only means of survival. No job means you can't afford to live. You might end up homeless all because of one mistake. As well, court dates and arrests can result in missed work, and in this day and age, you need those hours at work to be able to make ends meet. Many people can't afford to miss a shift. You lose your reputation, especially if the story makes it into the newspaper. Your name and mugshot is plastered on the internet, and remember that the internet never forgets and that everyone does a Google search on you. There will always be people who will think lesser of you because you have a marijuana charge on your record, or even an arrest. Even if the charges are dropped or you're acquitted, the process of being arrested, fingerprinted, and having a mugshot taken are punishment in and of itself. Going to jail is traumatizing. Sure, prison conditions aren't literally the same as the 19th century, and a lot of things have changed, but going to prison or jail is still dehumanizing, and you still lose your freedom. That's the important part. You lose your freedom for no fucking reason. You're locked away. You don't get to see your loved ones unless it's visitation day, and that's if they decide to visit or can visit. You don't get to enjoy the simple everyday pleasures of life, like walking outside in the fresh breeze, eating your favorite foods, or listening to your favorite music. You are no longer a person with a name. You get called inmate or prisoner number. You lose your sense of self. You have no privacy. You're constantly being watched. You're surrounded by violence, and you might even become a victim of violence in there too. The dismal surroundings bring down your mood even more. Studies have shown that prison changes people psychologically, and no doubt in these cases I talked about in this video, did it have a psychological effect? It had a psychological effect on all of them. It had a psychological effect on Brian Jones, even if he didn't spend very much time in jail at all, if any. He was still psychologically affected, and it shortens people's lifespans. Mental health is important. I'm tired of people virtue signaling about it, and then they don't do anything about it. And here's the sad part about jail. Not enough people care because they see prison as a place where those people go. And they're not like those people because they see people who go to prison as subhuman. Us and them. The opposite of solidarity. When the reality is, it could happen to any of us. Any of us. Keep that in mind. We need solidarity now more than ever before. Here's another thing. You could lose your driving license. Yeah, sure, in some of these examples, cars didn't exist. But yeah, it's possible that if you were convicted of marijuana, you could lose your driving license. And that means you'll have a harder time keeping a job and doing normal everyday things if you don't live in an area with adequate public transport. And that's especially crucial in America, where there are no bus systems in some areas, no metros, nothing, no trains, nothing. At least in England, where I live, yeah, there's some trains and buses. They're not great, but they exist. But still, if you're a gig economy worker who needs a car to do your job, and often that may be the only kind of job you can get, if you need a car to do your job and you can't drive, you lose your job. Or, I mean, sure, you can be a gig economy worker on a bike, but that's just miserable. And what if you're disabled and can't ride a bike, or you have bad knees like I do? You know, if you drive a car without a license, you could get in even more trouble. And there you go, it's an endless spiral. Things get worse and worse and worse, and that's exactly what happened to Brian Jones. That's what happened to Oscar Wilde. That's what happened to both of them. They ended up in this fucking spiral that ended up ending their lives. And so did many others. If you're a parent, you can have your kids taken away from you, even if you keep the weed far away from the reach of your kids. Maybe you still have custody of your kids, but let's say you want to chaperone their field trip, or their school dance, be their troop leader for scouts, or coach their sports team. You might not be able to do that because they'll do a background check and see that marijuana charge. You're going to be on the hook for a lot of fines, court fees, and legal fees, and if you can't pay them off, you end up in jail again. Which is actually counterintuitive because if you do a surface level analysis, it's actually a feature. It's not a bug in the system, because look at the wording of the 13th Amendment in the United States. Slavery is abolished except as a punishment for a crime. The reason the government started this war on drugs is to keep slavery going on, and for that, they need bodies in prisons, and going after stoners is an easy way to do that, and an easy way to control people. When you smoke weed, you start realizing things and waking up, and the government doesn't want you to do that. They want you to be compliant. As for other countries, many of these financial costs still apply, even if, they don't have the 13th Amendment and that wording. You could still lose your house. You could lose all your finances. You could be totally broke and then having to resort to crime or begging. If you like to travel, it's going to be more difficult or maybe even impossible. You may have the privilege of having a first world passport, but that doesn't mean anything if you have a marijuana charge on your record, or any criminal record really. If you want to travel outside the country, you might have to apply for visas, which are expensive and time-consuming to apply for, and even then, there's no guarantee you'll be granted one or allowed entry in the country. Instead of being able to enter on a visa waiver program, you're stuck filling out paperwork and paying lots of fees. And if you choose to lie about your record and you're caught, you might be banned from entering the country you want to travel to in the future. For young people, you can lose your future. It's possible that you might lose your scholarships and financial aid for university. You could be expelled or suspended from your university. Your career prospects can be hindered. For example, if you want to work with children, for example, you want to be a school teacher, you may not be able to do that with a marijuana charge on your record. And this one's for the immigrants and foreigners. Imagine a multiplier on all of these consequences. You have even more to lose if you have a marijuana charge on your record. Yes, even if you're a permanent resident. You could have your visa canceled, or when it comes time to renew it, they refuse to renew it. You could be deported and banned from entering the country you live in, and may even call home. If you have family in your new country, you may never get to see them again, or you have to spend big bucks to fly them over to visit you. Even if you're not deported and your visa is not canceled, if you have any hopes of becoming a naturalized citizen, you can kiss those hopes and dreams goodbye, because your citizenship application can be rejected all because you smoked weed that one time. It happened to Neil Young. If Neil Young couldn't easily get American citizenship with his huge net worth and fame, what chance does an ordinary person have? Neil Young could afford the best lawyers money can buy, and it was still a battle for him. Imagine if it was you. And what is the difference between you and Neil Young? Some money and a bit of talent. And here's the kicker. Sometimes when they legalize weed, they do not pardon all of those who have non-violent marijuana charges on their record. Those who are wrongfully deported are not allowed back in the country. Mistakes like this have been made in the past. When gay sex was decriminalized, gay and bisexual men who were convicted did not get pardoned for 50 years, in the case of England and Wales. And in the case of the United States, there are still no pardons. When women won the right to vote, suffragettes were not pardoned. We can't change the past, but we can act now and do what we can to right the wrongs of the past and make amends to create a better future. It's never too late to do the right thing. We can learn from the mistakes of the past. Gay and bisexual men deserve pardons straight away. Suffragettes deserve pardons straight away. Politicians must do the right thing now and legalize weed ASAP and pardon all of those with non-violent marijuana convictions. No delays. Decriminalization is not enough. And to compare once again with gay rights, it's like when they stopped jailing gay people as much and instead started fining them. Being gay is not a crime. Smoking weed is not a crime. This is why we need a clean slate initiative for all those with drugs charges. Another important thing we need is protection for those who use marijuana. Employers shouldn't be micromanaging your life. Your workplace does not own you. They only pay you for the hours that you are working. They shouldn't get to control you when you're not on the clock. Getting high on the weekends is no different from getting drunk on the weekends. Workplaces certainly don't fire people for drinking alcohol on their free time. And here's yet another parallel with the LGBT rights movement. When gay marriage was made legal, it did not always come with anti-discrimination protections for gay and bisexual people, and that is especially the case in the United States. So someone could get married to the love of their life and end up with a pink slip the very next day. And without anti-discrimination laws, they have no recourse. Of course, classism in the courts is another can of worms we can open and another topic for another time. One other thing to note is that not all of the Rolling Stones are heterosexual, and this isn't just a bunch of straight people trivializing gay rights. It's not a trivialization at all. Brian Jones was bisexual or bi-curious at the bare minimum. He had a crush on Dave Davis of the Kinks. Mick Jagger had multiple flings with men in the 60s and 70s. Once again, he's bisexual, or at the very least, bi-curious. Their song, She's a Rainbow, was the inspiration behind the pride flag. Therefore, the Rolling Stones are gay icons, end of story. You can also read my blog and find all the songs that the Rolling Stones did on gay people. I'll link the blog post down below. Still not convinced of the parallels? Well, all I can say is this. The fight for gay liberation and the fight to end prohibition is not about decadence or debauchery. It's about freedom. We need to legalize it now. No delays. Thank you very much.